It is. You know, it's amazing how, have you guys ever made it before? No. Okay, so good. So it's amazing how, how the process really impacts the result. You don't make it when you're rushed. You don't make it when you're stressed. You don't make it when you're upset. You make it when you're full of love, when you can stand over the stove, when you can stir and enjoy that time of just standing there, right, and watch it and transform into this like beautiful, luscious sauce. And it's all just, you know, it's all just about being there and making something very simple with very few ingredients that you probably will always have on hand, you know, and being able to spend the time loving it and coaxing it and stirring it. You will end up with something that is not only delicious and beautiful, but you know, food for the soul. I started a company called Kitchencue, just in case all of you don't know, and Chef sells our DVDs here, and we basically do exactly what we were talking about. We take techniques and we boil them down into 5 or 6 steps, and we say, if you can memorize these 5 or 6 steps, you can substitute any ingredient that you want, and you just do the same process. So that really makes you comfortable in the kitchen. It gives you confidence. You can whip out your saute pan and look to your pantry or your refrigerator and find something to cook. So it's a really powerful way of cooking. And so I wanted to bring that to risotto. So I wanted to say, okay, if you do these 5 steps with risotto, and we'll talk about the 5 steps, we're going to talk about why they're important. Anytime you make risotto, we'll have success. Risotto, first of all, let me say, is the dish itself, right? It is a grain of rice, a short grain rice, that's grown in northern Italy, and because it's a short grain rice, it's really starchy, kind of like sticky rice, as opposed to like a jasmine rice or a basmati rice. Yeah, I like that too. And so it gets very sticky, and you need to coax that starch out of it. And the way we do that is like cooking it very, very slowly, adding broth, just as we talked about, kind of standing over the stove and stirring. So there's a couple of different kinds of rices that you can make risotto with. There's the arboreal rice, which is the most common, and there is an arboreal rice now that's grown in California, the carnaroli, and that's not grown here, that's imported, that's from Italy, and that's a nice rice. And then the violone nano is a third kind of rice, which you don't see as much. And let me just say, classically in Italy, risotto is served as a course on its own. Right, it's a pasta. It's considered the pasta course. Here in America, you do find that it's served as a main course, which is fine too. And so therefore, you have lots of stuff on top sometimes. Like tonight we'll do the butternut squash with duck breast. So you know, you could slice the duck breast and put that on top, and that could be more of a main course. Let's talk about the 5 steps that we need to do to make the risotto. So the first step, the first thing that we do when we make risotto is we heat the stock. Right, so we want to get the stock just below a simmer. We don't want it to be boiling on the stove for an hour while we make the risotto, because then it will just reduce down in quantity, right, and concentrate the flavor, which we don't want. We want it to be as it is, a nice stock. You can use a homemade stock if you make your own stocks. You can use broth from the grocery store. I always go for the low sodium broths, just because you want to be able to control the salt yourself. Right, you're going to put in the cheese. Exactly, you might be putting salty things, like we're going to start the one dish with pancetta, which is already salty. Right, so you want to be careful with the broths. Go for low sodium. You could do chicken or beef or vegetable. Really, anything works. The reason that we do that we want to keep it hot, is because think about when you cook potatoes. You know how you start potatoes? You start them in cold water, right? Because they're big and you need to slowly heat them up, right? Well, these grains are very small. So if you're putting cold liquid into the grain, by the time the liquid heats up, the outside of the grain is completely mushy, right? And the inside is still hard. So we want a nice even cooking through the grain. So we want always to see what I call action in the pan. So you always want to see something moving around. You know, something's got to be moving. You got to be hearing something. Either the stock has to be simmering, or you know, the olive oil or the butter has to be moving. You always want to see movement. You don't just want it to be sedentary. So that way you know that there's enough heat to cook the rice evenly throughout the grain. So that's our first step. We heat the broth. The second step is to cut the onion the same size as the grain of rice. every risotto that I make, I will use some sort of allium, you know, an onion or a shallot or a leek or something like that as the foundation of the dish. And why I say cut it the same size as the grain of rice is because you don't want to see or taste or feel that onion or shallot. You want it to lay the foundation of the dish. You want it to provide its flavor, but you want it to just meld in to the rice. You don't want to have crunchy onion. You don't want to see it. You really just want it to meld into the dish. So cutting it very, very small and cooking it and sauteing it until it's very, very soft is important. So now we saute it. Now this is kind of included in the second step, but we saute it in fat, and that fat can be anything that we want. That fat can be butter, olive oil, bacon fat, duck fat. So we saute the onion or whatever we're using, the allium, in the fat very slowly, still seeing movement in the pan, but being careful not to brown the onion. Okay, it should still be nice and white. We cook it until it's meltingly tender. Then we want to make sure, usually you'll see in recipes, and tonight you'll work from these recipes, but I'm hoping that after tonight's experience you'll go home and not work with the recipe anymore for risotto and just put things in that you like, but to know that you have to have plenty of fat in the bottom of the pan when you're sauteing your onion, because you want to have enough fat to coat all of the rice when you put the rice in. So while recipes call for maybe what looks like a lot of fat in the pan to just saute a few onions, that's because you want to have enough fat to coat all of those grains of rice when you add the rice. Okay. The third step is adding the rice. And we do what's called toasting the rice at this point. And that does not mean brown it, but that means put it into the pan with plenty of fat, coat it, stir it around, and you'll see here the rice, you can see the grains of rice as they are raw. You cannot see through them. Once they get quote-unquote toasted, heated in that fat, you'll see that they become translucent around the outside of the grain, and that's what we're looking for. Once most of the grains become translucent around the outside, then we know the grains are sufficiently toasted, and we're ready to move on to the next step.